How's it going, everyone? We're finally back with another episode on the Corsa. This time we'll tackle the suspension and underside. We've got a lot of rusty chassis components and worn out suspension parts. There's much to do ahead of us, so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. This episode is proudly presented by Pureest. More about them later on in the video and a really good offer. We're picking up right where we left off in the previous episode, so let's get the car back up in the air and get to work. First things first, let's remove the wheels. And before even attempting to disconnect everything, I'm soaking every potentially stubborn fastener with penetrating fluid and brushing off any exposed threads. So the plan for this video is to remove everything that needs to be replaced or restored, starting from the back, working my way up to the front. And once I've done that, I will go ahead and reapply rust proofing on a lot of places, and I will walk you through the thought process there, how I like to think with an old rusty car like this, how I go about rust proofing that. And once that is all completed, it's time for reassembly, putting back brand new parts or restored parts. So yeah, we have a lot of work ahead of us, so let's get right to it. At first, I actually planned on removing the entire rear axle, but after inspecting the trailing arm bushings with a pry bar, I realized they weren't bad at all, so I decided to leave that alone. I am, however, going to change out the rear shocks and the brake fluid, and in order to do that, I first need to make sure that all 4 bleed screws can be loosened. So I wasn't as lucky on the left side. As we can see right here, the brake bleeder nipple actually sheared off, so I'll have to replace the brake cylinder, at least on this side. No big deal, but as we saw, no brake fluid was dripping out, and that is because the brake pedal is pressed right now with the help of a piece of wood, and that actually prohibits any brake fluid from leaking out because it creates like a blockage in the master cylinder. So really neat little trick if you're ever opening up the brake system. In order to gain access to the brake cylinder, you need to remove the brake drum, and that will also give us the perfect opportunity to repaint the drums. So the actual brake shoes themselves seems to be in good condition. There's still a lot of meat on them, but obviously, as I said, I will need to replace the wheel cylinder. And as we can see right here, one of the springs and retainers are missing, so I will need to order a new hardware kit. And I'll also be replacing the wheel bearing and the seal right here, complete new wheel bearing set, because I have actually noticed some noise coming from the rear left tire. But I will go ahead and replace the wheel bearings on both sides. There's a steel screw holding on an aluminium wheel cylinder, so a little bit of heat goes a long way when it comes to increasing your chances of removing old brake lines and fittings. Luckily, the brake fitting cracked loose from the wheel cylinder, however the fitting itself kept spinning with the brake pipe, but after some penetrating fluid and working it back and forth, it finally spun free. Fortunately, I had a couple of springs and retainers left over from the micro project that also fits the Corsa apparently. Next up, let's remove the worn out rear dampers. These actually came out without much fuss since the bolts were still covered by that thick undercoating applied many years ago. Let's not forget to remove the brake drum on the other side as well, and of course a couple of springs and retainers broke here as well, as the brake drum was really stubborn to get off. So there we go, everything is removed in the rear, at least for now. So let's continue with the front and just to remove all of the old parts that needs replacement. The first thing I'm gonna do is just to make sure that every bolt and nut can be undone, because if I go about removing, say, the strut completely, the knuckle will just hang off and you won't get enough support to undo stubborn bolts. So I'm just gonna go over every bolt and nut one by one, making sure that it can be undone, and then I will go ahead and just start to remove everything. I can't stress enough how helpful it is to soak everything down with a good quality penetrating fluid, letting it sit for a decent amount of time, and also cleaning off any exposed threads the best you can before trying to loosening rusty old bolts. Lucky for me, there were no casualties, as in no bolts snapped, so no drilling and tapping required. However, as we're going to see, I did have to replace a couple of bolts and nuts with new ones, which I definitely don't mind. That's one crusty old anti-roll bar removed. Next up, let's disconnect the control arms as well. I have to say, the front suspension setup on this car is quite unique, but it's definitely interesting to see. I feel like a lot of the mechanical designs on GM vehicles from this area was either a hit or a miss. Some things are genius and some constructions are just outright stupid. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Most of these parts are going to be replaced with brand new ones, but the anti-roll bar and these hockey sticks, as I like to call them, I will have to refurbish somehow. And I'll go with a more DIY friendly approach here that will actually last for a while. It's not going to be the prettiest, but it'll be functional. So first of all, let's remove as much loose rust as possible by scraping and wire wheel it. A sandblasting cabinet would be ideal here, but unfortunately I don't have that, and I suspect that most of you watching at home doesn't have that as well. So after removing most of the rust, I'm applying a rust converter, and once that has dried fully, I'm spraying the parts with a zinc primer, and then I'm actually applying a thick coat of rust proofing on top of that. It won't be as pretty as paint, but trust me, it'll last way longer than the cheap 1K paints you'll find at the store. For the brake jumps, however, I'm of course going for the more classical paint method. A lot of prepping and cleaning involved, but it'll definitely be worth it in the end. So the brake jumps are now painted and looking a lot better. Now obviously I won't expect this to last like 20 years or something, but I'm very happy with how it is right now. And this is also the perfect time to press out those outer races and replace with some new bearings, because you don't want a lot of rust flakes and dust, brake dust, and just overall dirt getting into the new bearings and the new grease and all of the surfaces on the bearings. That's obviously no good, so I definitely prefer to just leave the outer bearing races inside of the brake drum. That way it will create a perfect seal, or it will mask off the area so that paint doesn't get to the area between the outer race and the brake drum itself. So I just find it much more convenient this way, rather than removing the outer races first and then try to carefully mask everything off inside, because honestly, right now you have perfect masking off with the outer race itself, since it's in there. And as far as this surface goes, where the actual rim goes, well, honestly, it's no big deal if there's a thin layer of paint. I actually tried to avoid it, so the layer of paint here is much thinner than on here. But I find it easier to just try to remove the paint here afterwards, rather than trying to mask it off, because it's really easy to just sand it off or chemically remove this paint around here. But honestly, if you do have a very thin layer of paint, as in this case, it's not a big deal. I can almost guarantee you that you'll be perfectly fine as long as you torque the wheel bolts down properly. So yeah, with that being said, let's move on to the next stage. And that is to rust-proof the underside, or more precisely, I'm going to slow down the already existing rust and then top off the rust proofing on some areas and reapply it where it got washed away during the previous episode. Now, when dealing with already existing rust, I definitely think it's best to use something like fluid film. A product like that is honestly the only thing that seems to work when it comes to an old, already rusty car. I would suggest not to use the thicker rust proofing on existing rust, even if you brush it down with a steel brush beforehand, as the thicker kind of rust proofing doesn't penetrate the rusty metal in the same way that fluid film does. And consumer-based rubberized rust proofing, I would suggest to stay away from that stuff altogether. With that being taken care of, at least for now, let's go ahead and start to throw on some new shiny parts. And we're starting off by buttoning up the front end. These hockey clubs sits on top of the control arm and the bolts goes all the way through and holds on the ball joint as well. So in order to mount everything back up, we first need to remove the ball joints from the new control arm. Either way, I think it's really nice that these new control arms comes with brand new lower ball joints as well. Definitely putting on anti-seize on everything that risks getting stuck to make life easier for the next owner if that person ever needs to take anything off again. Brand new nuts and bolts for the lower ball joint. The bolts for the frontmost bushings were really rusty and beyond the point of reuse, so I had to source brand new ones with the same length, thread pitch and the same strength grade. So got everything loosely up in there, and for now I can go ahead and tighten these 3 bolts. I can tighten the ball joint, I can tighten these 2 bolts, but this bolt right here and this nut right here I will need to tighten when the car is on the ground and sitting at normal ride height. Same process on the other side, but I couldn't stand looking at this really nasty plastic shield right here, so I took it off and gave it a good clean with the help of some degreaser from Pureest. Speaking of Pureest, here's a quick message from this video's sponsor. Huge shout out to Pureest and their amazing detailing products. Right now, if you use the code ejoautovideos, you will get a free bottle of car shampoo with your next purchase. No matter how much or how little you order, just use that code and you will get a free bottle of car shampoo. This is valid for Swedish residents if you make an online order here in Sweden, so make sure to use that code if you buy anything from Pureest. In this particular video, I've been using their cold degreaser a lot in this pump spray bottle, and it really helps with dissolving that old tar-like undercoating. So super helpful there. This product really came in clutch for this episode. So yeah, with that being said, let's continue with the video. That's the control arms done. Let's proceed with remounting the anti-roll bar as well. Brand new anti-roll bar bushings, of course. Next thing to do regarding the front end suspension is to replace the strut top mounts. The shock absorbers themselves actually feels quite good when driving the car, so I didn't order new ones. Hopefully they will check out fine when testing them outside of the car as well. I ordered a kit that includes both the top hats and new strut bearings. And it's really the bearings that usually goes bad, so really glad I made sure to order a kit that includes both. Usually you can get the top nut off by sapping it off with an impact gun, but if you're going to reuse the damper, you should try to avoid that method because you don't want to spin the damper rod around at a high speed. Luckily, I managed to get the nut off by turning the socket with a set of pliers, as we can see right here. But for the last couple of threads, I like to sap that off with an impact while the strut is on the ground, just for extra safety. Both shock absorbers felt really nice as we can see, so really happy that I'll save some extra bucks at least on reusing the old dampers. We'll have to reuse the rubber seat right here, so let's go ahead and clean it up real quick. I'm cleaning up any loose rust and reapplying some rust proofing on the old dampers to make them look a little bit more pleasing to the eye. And there we go, one perfectly functioning strut assembly. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other one as well. For those of you who say not to use anti-seize on bolts like this, clearly don't live in an area with snowy winters and salty roads. Next up, let's go ahead and replace this worn out tie rod end. I'm leaving the locking nut exactly where it was so that the alignment is somewhat near what it used to be. However, the alignment on this car was completely off to begin with, and as we're going to see, the new tie rod end is not the same length as the old one, so I'll need to compensate for that. Either way, this car needs an alignment really bad, but that's something I'll do off camera at a workshop. I have tried the string method in the past, but in all fairness, I find that method to be quite time consuming and it's not as accurate as a professional laser alignment rack. And that's the front end done, at least for now, so let's go ahead and finish up the rear. First thing to do is to change out this old brake cylinder with that broken bleed screw. I decided to change it out on the other side as well since it's really old, and also I want the same style brake cylinder on both sides. And let's not forget to put in new springs and retainers on this side as well. I decided to change the wheel bearings as well in the rear, especially since I have the brake drums out. The old outer bearing races needs to be tapped out. Luckily, there are these two access slots that enables you to easily get them out with a punch and hammer. Let's go over to my extremely leaking hydraulic press to get the new bearing rings pressed in. Yeah, I just couldn't stand my leaking press anymore, so I decided to go out and find a new cylinder to replace the old leaky unit with. The inner bearing and seal gets installed at this stage before you put the brake drum back on the car. So let's go ahead and pack the new bearing with some fresh grease that was included in the kit. After that, we can finally put on these nice looking brand new rear dampers. And I can tell you, this probably made the most difference out of everything done in this video. Before, the car made all sorts of weird sounds coming from the rear, but now the car takes bumps and bad roads like a champ. There we go guys, 95% done now. Only thing that remains is to change out the brake fluid, bleed any air in the system, and then obviously tighten every bolt that goes through a bushing. I don't know if I will do that on or off camera. Either way, let's proceed with changing out the brake fluid. Look at that old brownish brake fluid. I don't know why, but I find it so satisfying to flush out old brake fluid. Maybe because I know how detrimental really old brake fluid can be to the system. I told myself to not touch the braking system any more than this in the front, as they are functioning perfectly for a change. But I just couldn't resist to at least check out the slider pins. They weren't stuck, but nearly all grease had gone away, so good thing I decided to inspect them. I actually did buy new glide pins just in case the old ones were stripped out or anything, but these were in perfect condition, so I'll keep the new ones as spare for any future project, as they are used in many other different car models. Really nice to see all these new and fresh components on the cars, so now we can finally put the wheels on and set the car back on the ground for the first time in a long time. Speaking of the wheels, I have actually already refurbished the summer wheels, but you'll see that and them going on the car in the next episode on the Corsa, where I'll finally give the car the full detail. With the car back on the ground under its own weight, let's go ahead and torque up the top mounts and all of the fasteners that goes through rubber bushings. Alright, so happy to say I'm finally done with this stage of the project. Everything mechanical that I wanted to fix is now taken care of. The test drive went really well. This is actually the first proper test drive that I've gone out on since the last episode even. So I haven't driven it much at all since, haven't gone out for a real test drive. But I can say it felt really nice. The car feels so much more stout now with all of the new suspension parts. It's pretty astonishing. So yeah, really happy about that. Everything turned out really good in the end, I think, for like a budget restoration of this kind. The next episode, I think you know what that is. That will be the full detail. That's honestly what I'm most excited about. Probably, just because I think it will be a really big difference and a really huge makeover with that red sun-faded paint. So stay tuned and I will see you in the next episode.